What is going on, everybody? It is another episode of the 5280 podcast. Glenn will be in just a little bit, but the Young Bucks are taking over the show, at least in the early portion of the show. But we certainly will have you covered with Gage and I, and we are excited to certainly get a chance to talk about, of course, those Denver Broncos. It was the first day of Broncos mandatory minicamp. Obviously, they already had minicamp, but this is literally mandatory minicamp. So, it's fun because we have the chance to certainly get to talk about at least some Broncos content, Gage. But after that, it's going to end up like scratching and, like nails on a chalkboard, try and, find and or create stories.
Yeah, pretty much that period from the end of mandatory minicamp to the beginning of training camp. That's the dry period where there's just really no storylines coming in. You have to basically scrape the bottom of the barrel to find content. I'm going to be doing a lot of film study content, stuff like that on Denver Broncos Syndicate just to try to get through these 6 weeks. And by the end of it, man, it's going to be well worth it because training camp will be upon us, and that'll be at least my first time to go out there and Broncos country's first chance to go out there and see what Bo Nix looks like in person, what the true year one of the Sean Payton era looks like. I am so excited and I'm ready. Football is in the air, but we just got to get through these next 6 weeks, man.
Obviously we'll get into the mandatory minicamp stuff, some of the takeaways that happened, but it's funny. You brought up training camp and you brought up obviously Sean Payton's, we'll just say technically his first year. It's his second year, but it's finally the year that he gets to run his stuff. Like it's the year that he can run, the things his way. It'll be really interesting to see how organized he truly is. The detail that he operates, like, from this last year that he had at training camp to now, knowing the fact that, he doesn't feel hamstrung, if you will, in terms of maybe the team that, he has at his disposal. So I think that's kind of like one of the things I'm really looking forward to in person with training camp is it a bit more detailed oriented? Like, is it actually like something like, every single station that you have that gets alternated, when you hear the horn blow, it's like once it hits like 12, right? Basically noon, that horn is blowing versus like 12:02, 12:03, 12:04, maybe even like a couple minutes after, or if someone didn't really do their job, we extend that time a little bit and we actually do blow it, at about like 12:10, 12:15, just to get that extra work in. So I'm curious about that.
Me too. And I will say this, based on the clips that we've seen and just reports that I've gotten from camp, it's a much more militaristic type operation at the line of scrimmage. You can really see that the quarterback has command at the line of scrimmage of the entire operation. Defensively, it's also very much been more of a tight ship, just militaristic. These guys mean business, and there's no effing around in Sean Payton's practices. You are going to be there to learn football and bust your ass every single day, and there's no music, lollygagging, fiddling around. It's all business.
There is music, but you're right, to your point.
There is music, but it's not like they're only playing it during like the beginning periods, like during team drills, stuff like that. Because we'd see music be played during team drills, like in the Vance Joseph era, and sometimes during the Nathaniel Hackett era. Not now, man. This is all business, all ball, all communication. That's been a big emphasis out at Dove Valley these past couple of weeks is communication, making sure everybody is on the same page.
Yeah. And so make sure you stick around and stay tuned to the MHRT network because every single Bronco-related show, this particular show, will always get you guys covered. Make sure you subscribe to the MHRT network on YouTube. Obviously, Bronco Syndicate with Gage over there and the shows that he does over there. We'll always get you covered with as much Bronco-related content that we can. All right, Gage, let's jump right into it. Cortland Sutton, he showed up He showed up to the mandatory minicamp. He does have those 2 years remaining on his contract this year, next year. Um, and you could tell maybe he was, a bit struggling out there. I mean, in terms of his first day back, um, and it was, it's interesting because, you know, did he ends up go to the podium and they ask him about his contract situation, basically saying that they're talking, but yet it's at a stalemate, if you will. Doesn't make any sense whatsoever. He's saying that they're talking and yet it's a
Uh-oh.
stalemate.
I lost your audio. Hold on.
But as far as it's just as far overall as just this whole Cortland Sutton saga just continues to roll on, you know, it gets so puzzling to me because like you see the drop passes, you see everything else, right? You see everything that has been transpiring.
I cannot hear you, Cam. Hold on.
We'll get Gage here in just a little bit. It seems like he can't hear the other side of it for me. But as far as Cortland Sutton, it's been frustrating. The guy's been asking for a new contract. Then he goes out there. He goes out there and he's struggling. He struggled and he drops a few passes, and so it at least on the initial side of things, it was not really the best look, especially if you want to be asking for a new contract. I mean, usually I would think you want to not necessarily be skipping a beat, right? Once you show up, especially for day one of minicamp. So yeah.
Sorry about that.
No, you're good. No, so we're good. You can hear.
I can hear you. Sorry about that.
No, you're good. We blame the cat.
Yep, always blame the cat.
Yeah. I was just talking about Cortland Sutton, and I was talking about how in basically day one, and granted, it is day one. It is day one, but
absolutely,
he's been barking a little bit. I should say maybe him and the agent side of things about the new contract. Then he goes to the podium. He asks, about the contract situation that they're talking, but yet it's at a stalemate. Doesn't even make a lick of sense at all. The fact that they're talking, but yet it's a stalemate, right?
Talk about an oxymoron.
It's a very oxymoronic thing to describe there. And then he goes out and he drops some passes. He drops some passes, and to his credit, I would rather those problems be right now than during games. But just falling in line with the whole contract idea, if you want that contract, if you want that raise, if you will, that he's been asking, it's not the greatest look, because it's not the greatest look, because you want to make sure you're turning heads. You want to make sure you're not skipping a beat the moment you do show up to mandatory minicamp. Wasn't really the case day one for Sutton.
And again, to play devil's advocate a little bit, it's day one, and he's only had reps with one quarterback out of the three, and that's Jarrett Stidham in the final game of the season and the practice leading up to it. Besides that, Cortland Sutton doesn't have chemistry with these quarterbacks, so I can somewhat forgive the dropped passes now. And like you alluded to, if this issue arises in training camp or preseason, beginning of the regular season, that is cause for concern. But going up on the podium today and giving basically a fluff job that you and your agent went over, saying how you want to be here, you want to be in the Ring of Fame, and you've been talking with the team, yet the contract negotiations are at a stalemate. I've said all along that I fully support Cortland Sutton wanting to get more guaranteed money, because if he were to get injured, he would be unprotected. But with that said, you have to go out there and you have to perform at the level that you're getting paid to perform at already if you're going to go out and ask for more money. And Thus far, Sutton hasn't done that. And if you're going to go out and have a rough first day of practice, and then after that practice, after putting on a crappy showing in front of the media, saying all this stuff, that's a questionable look. And it makes you question Sutton's true intentions. Does he really want to be in Denver?
Mm-hmm.
Does he really want to be a part of this team? Or is he trying to force his way out? Andrew Mason asked him, if this stalemate were to continue into training camp, would you consider holding out during camp? And he just said, we'll see. So, and kind of gave that same fluff job about how he wants to be here. He wants to be in the Ring of Fame. Clearly something that he rehearsed with his agent. I just feel like right now Courtland Sutton is sending a lot of mixed messages. And to me, I'm interpreting it as he does not want to be here and he's trying to find his way out somehow.
Yeah. What's up, Clayton? Make sure you listen to Clayton. Smash that like button and share. Give those fireworks, right? Give those fireworks.
Oh, yeah.
We always bring the fireworks every single time over here on the 5280 podcast, and of course the Mainly Broncos podcast. Also, I see you. I see you, Avatar. What's up, man? Graham, I see you in the chat. For anybody that knows, I hopped on to the show that they do. I want to say it's a Rocky Mountain Blitz on Sunday. And I kind of talked a little bit about the idea that Courtland Sutton is not necessarily a number one wide receiver. And, it's worth at least recycling that again, because that's what makes this whole Courtland Sutton dilemma such a fascinating one, because he already has this year and next year. Like if you will, the term is cost controlled. He has a cost controlled deal with the team. And so if they do move on from him, ideally the other team maybe would like to have that in terms of, on the books, in terms of cost controlled. But also the guaranteed money, if you will, is not all that much anymore. And so if they want to move on from him, if the Broncos actually want to move on from Courtland Sutton, if we were going to have that conversation, it's not out of the realm of possibility that he's a cap casualty this year. Like, it is not out of the realm of possibility. And so that's what makes what he's been doing so odd, because, you are making some decent money. It's not the Justin Jefferson money, which to Jefferson's credit and to when he signed the deal and everybody else that followed afterwards, it created a bump and increase for probably everybody else. But, there's levels to it, right? There's levels to that. And I feel like, for Courtland, wouldn't you want to actually show up to, regardless if it was voluntary, to show up to voluntary minicamp, because you have a new quarterback, rather than, bitch and complain that you actually wanted a new contract. Show up to minicamp and actually be the number one that we think that he probably should be, at least on the surface. Absolutely. I would have wanted that 100%, given the current status of the way the Broncos are being operated. But it's not out of the realm of possibility, Gage, that he is a cap casualty, or possibly even on another football team here soon.
Name me another team in the NFL where Courtland Sutton is the top target.
Man, you can't.
You can't do it.
Yeah.
Maybe the Carolina Panthers, but then you got Xavier Legette there, who they got in the first round, and then you got Deontay Johnson. Is Courtland Sutton really better than Xavier Legette or Deontay Johnson? I don't necessarily think so. He's a beast in the red zone. He does well in 50-50 ball situations, but he's not a well-rounded wide receiver. He doesn't do everything well. And if you're going to be a number one receiver, you have to either do everything well or have something that's beyond just 50-50 balls and red zone that you can contribute to the table, that's your calling card, your route running, your speed, whatever it may be. But the best receivers have that whole combination of all of it. And that's the skill set they're able to translate onto the field. And I'm sorry, you can't convince me that Courtland Sutton would be a number one receiver anywhere else. If he gets cut, he's going to get less money than what he's getting paid right now. I don't understand this whole bitching and complaining from Courtland's perspective, because if he were to want out, who's going to give you more money than what you're currently getting paid? Right. Not even the Pittsburgh Steelers. If your boy Russ goes to the front office and pounds the table for them to sign you, they're still not going to give you near the amount of money that you're making in Denver this year. I can again understand Sutton wants more guaranteed money to be protected if he gets injured, but I proposed this scenario to kind of find an end to this whole Courtland Sutton dilemma. Give him a few more $1 million guaranteed for 2024, shave off the final year of his deal, and let him be a free agent at the end of this year. I think that's a fair solution. The Broncos can keep him in the building this year, and then they can let him walk afterwards. Because I think the Broncos would have already moved Courtland Sutton if they were going to do so. Again, there's the whole conversation we had about cutting him for cap reasons, because they can save $13.5 million if they cut him, but I just feel like they would have already done that. So for me, the most realistic option to end this is give him some more guaranteed money this year, shave off that final year of his deal, and let him walk, and let some other team give whatever they're going to give to him financially.
And obviously the reason why I talk about cap casualty is sometimes you do see those players that become cap casualties because of not necessarily mandatory minicamp, but really training camp. And so where you really start to see things get the ball rolling and things really transpiring for possible roster creation, roster manipulation even, is really then, and especially with preseason. And you and I've mentioned this point before, and it bears repeating one more time again. His production is easily replaceable. Josh Reynolds and Tim Patrick is the next person we should probably worth noting here, in terms of him actually having a really good day. But Tim Patrick, Josh Reynolds, Patrick, possibly even Devon Bailey, possibly. Those are the types of players that are really going to make him expendable. Obviously, I've really made it known that that Bailey is probably the one that would ideally make Sutton the true expendable one, because if we are getting the consistent rave reviews about this, then it's really going to get to the point where the Broncos really would have no choice really to move on from him, because then at that point, you want to make sure you are rolling. It sounds very negative. It sounds very just disheartening when you say it this way, but I want players, but it's the truth. I want players that are on this roster who want to be on this roster. And if the things progress, and if things progress into the way things are appearing right now with Sutton, is I don't know if I want Sutton continuing to be on that, specifically even trending in the direction of, if it's an easily replaceable production, why not continue that theme and going with that younger generation? And yes, to Graham's point, look to 2025, possibly in the first round for wide receiver, or spend that beloved money that you will have, which is that $100 million possibly in cap space, and go out and chase possibly a wide receiver who could be a wide receiver one on the market, not just maybe even.
Was that a pun?
Right. And not just even in free agency, but trade for players, right? There, and I said it before, there are two players in San Francisco that are probably bearing watching, in terms of the wide receiver position, guys like Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel. I'm drooling at the idea of Deebo Samuel actually with Sean Payton, to possibly see what he could, craft up with him in Mile High. But anyway, that is still yet another conversation for another day. But I brought up his name though, Tim Patrick Gage. He had a great day.
Yeah,
he had a great day for the first day of OTAs.
Yeah, man. Tim Patrick catching everything that was coming towards him. Benjamin Albright tweeted out that he looks back. Reports reporters can't go into the schematic specifics, like what routes he was running, stuff like that, but they can say that Tim Patrick looked for the first time this offseason like he was back and was back to his old self. That's really good to see, man, because if Tim Patrick continues to raise his stock here in Denver, then Courtland Sutton can very easily become expendable. Tim Patrick and Courtland Sutton can fill very similar roles on this offense. And if Courtland Sutton's gone, then I could see a scenario where Tim Patrick becomes the X, and then maybe Devon Vele fills like the big slot role that Sean Payton wanted to utilize Tim Patrick in last year and probably still envisions this year. There are a lot of different personnel mixing and matching that can happen if Tim Patrick is able to stay healthy and continue to grow and develop in this offense. I'm really, really happy that the reports coming out of minicamp so far have been positive, because the reports coming out of OTAs for Tim Patrick weren't that positive. Some, even guys who are more conservative with their Bronco analysis, like Andrew Mason, were hinting at the idea that Tim Patrick might not be on this roster early on in OTAs, but now he's really starting to take shape, and that's to be expected when you're coming off of back-to-back lower body injuries like an ACL and Achilles. You're going to have your good days, you're going to have your bad days, and today sounded like it was a really damn good day from Timmy P.
And if you're going to keep a spade, and everything that has been transpiring with that Broncos wide receiver room, Gage, who really is wide receiver one in that room between, the people that are in that room? Tim Patrick, I think, has a fair argument, despite being out of, in the injuries that he sustained. He's got truly a fair argument to be made that he might actually be the wide receiver one of that entire bunch. And he's such a likable guy. Like, he is such a likable player to where he's easily rootable. He's easy to root for. I just might have made up a word there.
Rootable.
But yeah, right. Oh, look who decides to show up. It is none other than the bald man himself, Glenn Hauser. Did they
What's
win?
up, fellas? Thanks for holding down the fort.
Did they win?
They won, and they're heading to the championship game this week. So very excited. So
I want to get your thoughts on this. We recently were going off on our conversation about your favorite wide receiver to talk about on the Denver Broncos roster, and that is none other than Courtland Sutton, of course. Your favorite wide receiver to talk about, but he showed up to mandatory minicamp, and you're just catching up, of course, as we're talking about Tim Patrick too. But your thoughts on Courtland Sutton finally showing up to mandatory minicamp, but also having the case with the dropsies on day one.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where I don't know if you got a chance to see him on with the DNVR fellows, but it made me back off my stance a little bit, just in the sense that I really didn't think that he was wanting to be with this team, and it sure seems now that I was mistaken. But this is what happens when you're training with other people, when you're not training with some of the quarterbacks that are going to be throwing to you on a regular basis. Your first practice is truly your first practice, and it's not the first for these other guys. So can't say I'm all that surprised, but I am glad to hear that Tim Patrick is looking really, really good. I mean, that was a good report from Albright.
Yeah, it is a really good report. And, we are talking about a guy as you just came in, we're talking about a guy who, if there's really a fair argument to be made about who really is possibly wide receiver one on this team, despite the injuries, there really is that argument that Patrick might actually be the wide receiver one on this team. And given how everything is shaken out, just, the way that things have happened, he's a true leader on the team. He's a true leader on the team. He's very beloved in that locker room. Those are very under the radar and yet, meaningful things that if you really want the makeup of possibly a wide receiver one, that's where things really do fall in line with Tim Patrick possibly. And let me ask you guys this too. What are your expectations for guys like a Courtland Sutton and specifically a Tim Patrick? Let's just start with you, Glenn. Like, what are your expectations for a guy coming off of that Achilles injury? And especially, they did bring him back on such a small deal that, we really may not have talked about him much, but he may be higher on the list too about players that possibly are worth an extension, depending on how he does this year.
Right. With Tim, I'm not expecting massive stats where I think his value is going to be, and I do think he's going to contribute on the field and make a difference in this offense, especially with a younger quarterback. Where his value is with this young receiver room and just in the locker room in general. The fact that here's a guy that was on a huge trajectory, undrafted free agent to begin with in his career, ends up getting, his big contract, and then 2 catastrophic injuries 1 year after another. And here he is back again, was willing to take a very team-friendly deal to stay with the Broncos. And as far as stats goes, I mean, if he got 40 catches to 40 to 50, I would be absolutely thrilled. And I hope that's low.
Yeah.
What do you think, Gage?
I think, Tim Patrick has the chance to really swing the pendulum any direction. He could swing it to where he's the top receiver, where he maybe gets some of the lion's share of the targets. But it's all going to depend on his health and also the roles of the other players on this roster, like Josh Reynolds, Marvin Mims, Courtland Sutton, if he's still here. All of those are going to play a factor in Tim Patrick's production. But I think that today was probably the best news that we could get, that athletically he's looking good. That was my concern with him, was that after having 2 devastating lower body injuries combined with his previous injury history, he had a gruesome ankle injury in college. I was worried that maybe some of that athleticism and explosiveness would be zapped, but to this point, it seems like that's all back. The concerns with Tim Patrick early on in OTAs were mostly drop related, but now he's really starting to take shape, and athletically he's looking good. That's the biggest sign of encouragement. Stats, again, man, I'm not sure, because I don't really know what Tim Patrick's role in this offense is going to be. But based on what we saw from him in training camp, especially last year with Russ and Sean Payton, he was going to be a big part of this offense. And I still think Sean Payton envisions a big role in this offense for Tim Patrick. But it's all going to, again, depend on several factors, from health to role of other players on the team.
Yeah, and that's kind of like where I'm so puzzled about just the whole idea about, the Broncos and the wide receiver room, specifically the offense, about how it's all going to unfold, which is, certainly they will run the ball. They will run the ball, but I think we were going to be looking at it a bit differently, in the sense that it's going to be a very nice, dispersion, if you will, of all the targets that are going to be to Josh Reynolds and Franklin and Sutton and Mims and all these other, options, that I think we will finally get a chance to see those 10, 12 targets a game to very different targets, something we haven't actually had a chance to see really since Peyton Manning. But I think that, Graham mentioned it in the chat there, but I think the 700, mark, the 700 yards mark is probably a nice little, estimate for me, is probably where I'm looking for, which is funny, because we talk about possibly replicating Courtland Sutton's production, and we talk about, possibly why him possibly, could be off the roster. A stat line like that of 700 yards and possibly a couple touchdowns would actually mean that he could be easily replaced on the roster, but 700 yards is really kind of like where I'm kind of looking at, and I like the 40 catch mark, if you will. So 40 catches for the 700 yard, maybe 7 to 750, I think is quite doable and should actually be expected, because a guy coming off of those Achilles injuries, you're not like expecting oh, he's going to go for 1,000 yards. He's going to be the comeback player of the year, like so. But no, just but let's keep the bar low a little bit. But 700 yards, I feel like, is the nice little benchmark for that in terms of him coming off that Achilles injury.
And I know things can change, but do you guys anticipate at this point, if you had to bet, would you think that any receiver is going to eclipse 1,000 yards?
I doubt it. I think just with the sheer amount of people that you have to spread the ball around to, not just receivers, but also running backs. And if one of your tight ends can emerge, then them as well. There's just so many different options in the receiving game that I think that it's going to be hard for a guy to eclipse 1,000 yards. But I think that's a good thing. I think that wide receiver by committee has shown that it can work in the NFL. And maybe the Broncos don't need a true number one. If they've got a bunch of guys who can fill each given role effectively, then maybe they don't need a certain guy who can fill each and every single role,
Yeah, and I think that I'm with you guys. I really don't necessarily see a player that, is a true wide receiver one, in terms of a player that's going to be, eclipsing that 1,000-yard mark. But I wonder, though, this is where I really kind of, start envisioning the idea of Troy Franklin and Marvin Mims in these particular areas, because Marvin Mims being, the underneath and deep wide receiver. Franklin, obviously, we know, having that comfortability with Bo Nix already, but also being a deep threat and even some underneath, possible, targets for him. I think it's going to be one where specifically the Sean Payton offense and how it predicates on, yak ability, right? I think that Troy Franklin and Marvin Mims are probably the two that I would want to look into that particular area, because I feel like they could just eat up so much yardage with who they both are as wide receivers, fast and in terms of elusive in that yak. So I agree with you. I don't think we do see one that is 1,000 yards, but if I had a couple to at least throw out there, it probably would be the Troy Franklins and the Marvin Mims of the world.
Makes sense. It really does.
So a couple other what ifs, all right, so Cortland's here at mandatory minicamp, but training camp rolls around. There's been no movement on his contract. Does he show up for the first day of training camp?
Let's talk about,
that's the question.
Yeah. It's just going to be really interesting to, watch, because the one thing, and I briefly actually mentioned this before you hopped on, Glenn, but I thought it was so funny when he went into the media and he talked about his contract today, and he said they're talking about his contract, but they're at a stalemate. That's very oxymoronic. If it's a stalemate, like you're not talking. The whole point of a stalemate is an impasse. Like, there is no conversations, being had. So yeah, and me and Gage talked about it, how much it was driving, probably from the agent and stuff there. But I mean, it's worth repeating that for me, it's about the production. If Sean Payton feels like the production is easily replaced, hence 700 yards from Tim Patrick, but if it's can be easily replaced by a couple of these players on the roster, and specifically training camp and specifically preseason and how they do, there really is a possible scenario where Cortland's son is actually looking for work at another football team, after, after like the end of training camp and possibly into preseason.
I think that is a very distinct possibility. And my other question was also, and we can get to it, but about whether if he's on this team, whether he retains his captaincy, because I could see that changing and perhaps going to number 12.
Yeah.
But, in this day and age, I mean, where receivers are now making $30-35 million. And, there are so many available receivers. And I'm not saying like you can replicate a Justin Jefferson, but is a guy making $6 million that much worse than Justin Jefferson? My fear for that position is I could foresee that almost going to a similar state as the running back position, where those guys were making a lot of money. They were featured players, and then all of a sudden there was a shift in the league where it was running back by committee. The salaries, with the exception of McCaffrey just getting his big deal, but the salaries dipped a little bit. And so now they were sharing that bigger pie. And I could see that with some of these teams where if you don't have a guy making, 1,500 yards and 12 touchdowns, we're not going to see a guy making that's receiving 700 yards receiving, getting a $15 million or $20 million contract. I can't see that continuing. It's too much money. I mean, you're going to look at, between two players, you could have a quarterback and a receiver making $100 million of the cap.
Yeah. And I'm all for finding young, cost-controlled options. And the Buffalo Bills found this out because they have a quarterback who's taking up a significant chunk of their cap space. They had a wide receiver in the building who, let's just be honest, his production was starting to decline, and he wasn't living up to that level of money. So they decided to part ways with him and get that money off of their books. They are kind of approaching it as a wide receiver by committee approach, and I honestly think that could work out in your favor. But you also have to have a quarterback who can make that formula work. The Kansas City Chiefs made that formula work because they had a quarterback who could kind of get them through their rough periods where sometimes that didn't work. Obviously you had guys like Kadarius Toney, who was an outright liability on the team. Rashee Rice was the only consistent wide receiving option that the Chiefs had, and he might not be there now. I still have questions about Xavier Worthy translating to the NFL. So I don't know, man. I think the Kansas City Chiefs have a lot of question marks, but they also proved that a wide receiver by committee approach can win you a Super Bowl.
Yeah, and what actually the driving force of that, the driving force of that is obviously, the quarterback position, as you alluded to, but also head coach, right? And, it really helps having, arguably a top 5 coach of all time, right? In Andy Reid. And so I definitely foresee, something like that happening. It's almost like a Moneyball approach, right? To a certain degree with the wide receiver position. But
let me ask you this, Cam, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but before you pivoted to another point, is what do you think is going to happen with the Dallas Cowboys next year if they re-sign Dak Prescott and then you have CeeDee Lamb looking for JJ money?
Well, that's
$100 million right there. Yeah,
and that's where I think the whole wide receiver position is going to be such an interesting one to follow. And if there is anything that would actually follow an NBA type style in terms of contracts positionally, it would be the wide receiver position, because you have your wide receiver ones, which clearly the wide receiver ones that are true wide receiver ones are going to probably at one point be making that 30 to 35. Well, the wide receiver twos, the wide receiver threes are going to probably end up making the Courtland Sutton money right now, which is like the 15 to possibly, maybe 20 million possibly. And then you have the 20 to 25 million, if you will, for wide receiver twos. So it's like, if there's anything that it can compare rather favorably to like NBA contracts positionally, it would probably be the wide receivers, the way that they can, shake out in terms of the contracts and the deals that they do. So, but I'm curious with Dallas, because and specifically with how things have been shaking out with Dallas and Jerry Jones really not forking over all the money, if you will, to pay some of those players. I wouldn't be surprised if Dak is not getting that second contract and they actually want to give it to CeeDee Lamb. I mean, like, it's worth repeating, but the same thing happened with another 88 in Dallas, a guy that they probably should have been keeping long term, and they didn't, and that was Des Bryant. And the same thing possibly could happen with CeeDee Lamb. I think you could argue that maybe they got some Des Bryant PTSD and they will actually want to keep CeeDee Lamb, but
Graham Trey Lance season. That's good.
Right. But I think there is a multiverse out there, a reality out there, where the Dallas Cowboys are not just talking about a new quarterback, but a new wide receiver one next year also.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm starting to hear the winds of change a blowing there in Dallas. Last year was their year. That was the best roster they were going to have with this current core. And they failed miserably. They lost a lot of talent this offseason. There's no way that Dallas is going to be nearly as competitive, especially with a subpar head coach in Mike McCarthy. Mike McCarthy has actively held this team back from reaching their potential, him and Dak Prescott. And I think that Jerry Jones has kind of realized that this last year was our opportunity and it's gone. It's time to hit the reset button in Dallas. It's time to move on from Dak, move on from CeeDee Lamb if you can't reach a deal, and just hit the reset button. Bring in a new quarterback, bring in a new wide receiver on cost-controlled rookie deals. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Shedeur Sanders isn't a Dallas Cowboy next year. I know Jerry Jones loves him some Shedeur Sanders. I think that Jerry's kind of just counting the days until he can move on from Dak's contract at this point. He's given Dak 2 deals. They've both been bloated whales, and they've both actively hurt the team. They can't do that. They can't move forward with that.
So where does he end up next year?
Hopefully not Denver if Bo Nix doesn't pan out.
I think a very interesting team that is going to be worth following here is actually Miami. Because you got the Tua contract upcoming, and obviously there's no state tax, just like in Dallas, and obviously, so I think Miami is a really interesting team, and specifically with Mike McDaniel and that speed there that they have. I wouldn't be surprised if Miami actually rolled the Brinks truck a little bit and actually brought in, Dak for Miami. But so I would not be surprised by that at all. It looks like Big E and D-Rock are both mentioning Seattle as far as a team.
I could see Seattle. Miami is another one of those teams I feel like should not be in the business of spending big money on a quarterback when they have such a strong offensive core with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. They've got a solid offensive line. They've started to lose some pieces on defense. I think that Miami is a team that would be very detrimental to pay Tua Tagovailoa or any quarterback that much money because you're going to lose pieces of that core. They're a team that I feel like could have success with a young, cost-controlled quarterback, bring in another piece to that core, and I think that team could seriously contend for a Super Bowl. Tua Tagovailoa is somebody whose physical limitations really reared their ugly head in that playoff game against the Chiefs, where it made it clear that Tua's not a guy who can really throw the ball in cold weather. He's not a guy that can, in the playoffs, go into a city like Baltimore or Kansas City and pull out a dub. The Dolphins have a roster that's capable of contending for a Super Bowl, and I think that they'd be much better off with a young, cost-controlled quarterback, maybe a Shedeur Sanders, maybe a Carson Beck out of Georgia, whichever one of these other quarterbacks from the 2025 class emerges. I think the Miami Dolphins would be a lot better suited going in that direction, much like the Dallas Cowboys, because I think both of them would benefit from having a young, cost-controlled quarterback.
Yeah.
Or in Miami's case, continuing that.
What about you, Glenn?
I'm with Gage on not paying Tua the big money. I think there's just too many question marks there, and quite honestly, some other options, around the NFL. I mean, they're paying their wide receivers some huge money already, and Tyreek Hill is due for another deal. I just think when you have Hill, and then if you give Tua $50 million a year, $55 million a year, all of a sudden, it's so top heavy with three players that your advantage of having this talented team from that's generally across the board is going to have to disappear because some of those other fringe players you're going to have to get rid of for salary considerations.
Yeah.
And even if you're able to keep your core together, you're going to probably lose your depth.
Yeah. It is just kind of crazy to think that, ironically, the Broncos actually could end up with CeeDee Lamb, just not in terms of his first leg of the contract. They actually could end up with CeeDee Lamb on actually getting him on that second contract. So it's kind of crazy actually thinking about that scenario, which I'm sure, myself included, and probably some Bronco fans are already, but thinking about the idea of CeeDee Lamb as a Bronco for almost 4 or 5 years now. So
Cortland Sutton did go to college in Dallas. He is from Texas, so I mean that could
and
work out.
Denver's got the money to burn, man. They could afford CeeDee Lamb if he hit the market easily.
Yeah. Right. So one of the other things that is certainly worth mentioning in terms of Broncos mandatory minicamp is there's some other good news. There's some other good news in terms of a player that is actually the best of the position. It's the running back position, and it's a guy by the name of Jaleel McLaughlin, right? Jaleel McLaughlin being actually the best of the bunch, not best between Blake Watson and Jaleel McLaughlin, but the best of the entire bunch.
And it's ironic that we bring him up late in the show because that guy's always early.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
Love it. Jaleel, man, is somebody I've been a fan of for a long time. One of the founding members of the Jaleel McLaughlin fan club.
That is
I'm
true.
so happy to hear this, man. I think that Jaleel McLaughlin clearly has the work ethic. Sean Payton highlighted that in a previous press conference, how Jaleel's the first one in the building besides like security staff. By the time everybody else is arriving, Jaleel's been there for an hour and a half and he's having breakfast. That just goes to show the work ethic that this cat has. He's dedicated to getting better each and every single day. And I think that dedication is paid off because Jaleel has an opportunity without Audric Estime missing all those reps until training camp. Javonte Williams just continues to not quite look like himself. I think that you have somebody like Jaleel McLaughlin who's hungry, and hunger can drive a lot in this league in terms of seeing snaps. It really can. And Samaje Perine, just to not forget about him, I think he'll still be here filling the Samaje role, the third down, pass protecting running back. But with a quarterback who can place balls better on screens and swing routes and stuff like that, I think that we could see an even bigger role for Jaleel McLaughlin in the passing game.
You mentioned his hunger, and Gage, what's interesting and ironic about that comment is that, like, growing up, he actually was hungry. I mean, like, literally, they were homeless, sleeping in the car. There was a lot of struggle, food insecurity in his life. And so this guy has made the best of every situation that he's been into. And I'm so glad he signed with Denver when he didn't get drafted. And what's cool is that Sean Payton has now mentioned it, I think, at least 3 times over the last 2 seasons, or the last, since he came into that he is the first one in the building. It's just very interesting that that's a narrative that the head coach, I mean, that's who you want saying stuff like that.
That's right.
And another cool thing for me with him was in the uniform reveals is that he was included in that. And if he was one of those actually he got one of the throwback uniforms, which was so cool.
Yeah.
But I was so happy for him, like there was some talk after the draft that maybe he, that that he wasn't gonna, that maybe he was in jeopardy, and maybe he perhaps still is, but the fact that they put him in the uniform reveal really says that this is a guy that they expect to be around for a while.
Yeah, and it's just such a fun story because I think we get wrapped up, myself included, into the other underdog story of Blake Watson. Again, not a guy I want to sleep on either in terms of Blake Watson, but like, not to get too hot take oriented related with Jaleel and the news of today, but if it continues that the Jaleel is playing the way that he's doing right now, at least in mandatory minicamp, there's a realm of possibility that the jumpstart of rebuilding that running back room very well actually could start this year in 2024. And I mean, like, the two players that we actually feel like that are on expiring contracts, as crazy as it sounds, they could very well move on from Samaje Perine and Javonte Williams this year in 2024 and roll with the future of that running back room, which would be Audric Estime, Blake Watson, and Jaleel McLaughlin. Like, there is actually, I feel like, a window where that is your futuristic, running back room going forward, for quite a few years there. So it would not surprise me in the least bit to see that. And I love the actual idea of keeping both Watson and McLaughlin on that 53-man roster, because you are talking about a player who, in terms of McLaughlin and Watson, McLaughlin specifically, that when Payne was talking about him last year, he was a player that was hitting the hole, like the thinnest of holes. And when you can possibly have that coupled with Watson, you're talking about a dynamic duo. Yeah, they're maybe the same to a certain degree, but like, it allows you a lot of versatility in the passing game, because if there's one thing we know, I personally feel like Watson is the one that compares a bit favorably, right? Compares a bit favorably to Kamara. But you have more versatility in that running back room where you can use actual designated running back plays out of the backfield for not just Samaje Perine, which is basically what we saw in 2023, but you actually have designed plays now for guys like a Blake Watson, for a Jaleel McLaughlin, maybe even a Javonte, or, of course, a Samaje. So it's just like there's a lot more versatility at your disposal now with those guys in the room.
Gage, what do you think of this comment?
When Jaleel becomes a breakout star, he'll be the epitome of lead by example. I totally agree, D-Rock. I totally agree. I think that he's already showcasing that. And I know he's already somebody that young players in that locker room look up to and respect. And he's only a second-year player. Just think about that. Jaleel McLaughlin's a guy who clearly has the work ethic. He's got the drive. And like I said already, he's got the hunger. And that will take you far in this league. Let me pose you guys this question. Do you guys think that the running back who has the most to prove this year is Javonte Williams?
Yes, I do. I think Javonte is actually up there. I think if you talk about in terms of the players that have the most to prove, the two players that at least roll off the tongue for me automatically are Greg Dulcich and Javonte Williams. Javonte, there was a small stretch there in 2023 where you kind of got caught up into the idea, oh wow, he actually looks great. Like, we are starting to finally get the Javonte that we saw with 2022. But he hit a wall. Now kudos to Javonte, because him simply finishing the year was as big of a success, as anything, not getting injured and him really not sustaining any other injuries. And actually, it seems like in the clips that we're seeing from camp, the brace is gone, right? The brace is gone, at least it seems like in the clips that we've seen. But there were times where, specifically when he was running, he was not hitting a hole. It was like his vision was just reading a brick wall. Like, the vision was just not there. And unfortunately, due to the fact that you have Jaleel, but, Blake Watson, Audric Estime, like, they've added 3 backs in 2 years, to that roster. So it's not really ideal for a guy like a Samaje Perine or even a Javonte in terms of long term on the roster.
Remember
Bring up this comment again about Pirine at fullback.
All right.
Because I don't think it's as crazy as you would think because of how well he blocks. Mm-hmm. I think the Broncos do have an established fullback on the roster in Mike Burton. But maybe they want to think about it like, okay, let's try to fill 2 roles here with 1 stone. And you could keep Samaje as kind of an H-back, fullback, and I think he could do well in that role, and then still utilize him as kind of a third down receiving back. When he was drafted by Washington, he was a fullback. Okay, there you go. I think that it may on paper sound a little crazy, but when you think about it, it actually could make some sense.
So when Baker Mayfield was with Cleveland and he got hurt and then he played through the injury and was not successful, all of a sudden the bloom was completely off that rose. Whereas had he spent more time recovering from it, there's a high likelihood he still would have been the Browns quarterback and they wouldn't have gone after Deshaun Watson. And I kind of feel like there's a similar aspect to Javonte Williams. I think there's not a person in Broncos country that doesn't have respect for him and how he came back. And he came back so quickly from that devastating injury. And when he was rocking and rolling for a bit, and then when, as the season wore on, Cam, you described what, the pitfalls of what happened. And I think a lot of it had to do was with the fact that he likely came back too soon from that injury and just ran out of gas. And I hope he doesn't end up losing his job as moving forward as a result of working so hard to come back sooner than later. It'd be interesting to see how training camp goes, who's getting the majority of the reps with the first team. But he is in jeopardy, I think, of not being a member of this team this year, after when final cuts come to pass.
And obviously, Gage and Glenn know, but I've made it known that I feel like Samaje was probably the one that's the outside looking in, not necessarily Javonte. But I do think that Javonte, it's certainly, worth noting that he may not be the long-term solution, for the Broncos, but there's still a scenario where he could be on your 2025 roster. It's just about the 26 and beyond is where it kind of gets a bit dicey for a guy like Javonte. But getting a little bit defensive with the Denver Broncos now, it seems like there were a couple other standouts in terms of mandatory minicamp, in terms of day one. It appears that Nick Bonito is continuing his training camp trajectory. I say that 10 times fast. In terms of where he was this last year in 2023, started to kind of get the same stuff that we've been hearing in 2023 with Nick Bonito. And the guy they recently just acquired from the New York Jets, a guy that made Jets fans so mad. And that would be John Franklin Myers, the law firm of John Franklin Myers. And of course, the guy who has been competing for cornerback number 2, and it is not Demario Mathis, ladies and gentlemen. It is Riley Moss. Riley Moss had a really good day competing in day one of mandatory minicamp.
You ask Cam, and Graham will. Your wish is his command.
Your wish is his command. I think that when it comes to a guy like Nick Bonito, it's a continuance from last year where he had really, really strong days during OTAs, during minicamp, and then training camp. He took it to a whole nother level. And seeing a similar trend this year, Nick Bonito almost hit double-digit sacks last year, and I think he's got a strong possibility of actually getting there this year. If the Broncos are looking for a true alpha edge rusher, Nick Bonito has the potential to be there. He's just got to get a little bit more well-rounded as a run defender, but as a pure pass rusher, this dude he's like a literal ball of lightning that's been jammed into a bottle. That's what Nick Bonito is. His get off and his athleticism is absolutely insane. He's a guy that will wreck shop in a practice where there's no pads and tackles can't really do their job. This is what you would expect to see from a guy like Nick Bonito, and it translated onto the field last year when the pads came on. I expect that to continue, and Nick Bonito could be the guy who ends up leading the Broncos edge rushers in sacks when it's all said and done.
Yeah. I'm curious about Bonito because I really do think he's such a fun one, because there's a lot of people in that room that I feel like you could actually see, really lift the room and become, edge rusher number one. I think the thing for Bonito is I need to see a bit more in terms of like the pass rush, moves and the way that he gets to the quarterback. I will need to see a little bit more from him there, and obviously run defense. That's where I kind of, been pushing a little bit with Jonah Ellis, because Ellis is roughly the same stylistic pass rusher that Bonito is. But he's got a little bit more to his game. But if there's one thing that we know, and I actually said this on the Rocky Mountain Blitz on a show that Graham does for the Colorado Connection. But if there's one thing that we know that always translates so well to the NFL, it's the pass rush win rate, right? And that quick first step. And Bonito had that. Like, there was a crazy statistic that came out when he was drafted that he had the fifth best pass rush win rate of any pass rusher in the last like 6-7 years or something crazy like that. Like, even dating back to like when Myles Garrett was in college, and he was in the top 5. So it's he's got the trajectory, and I think that the thing that is worth repeating even more so here is that them keeping Jamar Cain was a massive, massive win for Nick Bonito. People that don't know about Jamar Cain, Cain was at Oklahoma when Bonito was really starting to make a name for himself, as a pass rush specialist. And, it's worth noting that he's now the defensive line coach. Like, he's the defensive line coach now, for the Broncos. So it is certainly possible that we do see another season for Bonito, but I'm very curious to see what's going to be entailing with just that entire room. I mean, I think that Bonito has the chance to possibly be, a guy that really lifts that room. Ellis is a guy that could really lift that room. I'm looking specifically at a guy like Baron Browning. Baron Browning needs a great year in 2024. If you want to actually talk about possibly one of the more well-rounded pass rushers and even possibly run defenders in that room, Baron Browning actually feels like that kind of guy. Funny enough, it's both those Ohio State guys, Jonathan Cooper and Browning. Cooper's the Tim Patrick of the room, right? He's the Tim Patrick of the room. He's the Mr. Consistent. He's the guy that's going to get the job done more often than not. But the flashier, players, that's where you really want to look at a guy like a Nick Bonito, a Jonah Ellis, and a Baron Browning. But the Drew Sanders stuff is going to be quite fascinating. I saw that comment there. The Drew Sanders stuff is going to be interesting. Yeah.
Drew Sanders is a guy who, first of all, he's got to get healthy. That's priority number one for him. He's got to find his way on the field. And when he does find his way on the field, the question is going to be how much of his development and growth was stunted by this injury. The Broncos seem to indicate that they were going to keep Drew on the edge. At least that's what George Paton said in January. They then made the move to let Josie Jewell walk in free agency. Mm-hmm. They brought in a guy like Cody Barton, who, I'm just going to be honest, his play in Washington last year was not very inspiring. I don't really view Cody Barton as a starting caliber player, but by default, he's going to have to start. So I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see if maybe Drew Sanders, when he does get healthy, pivots back to the inside. I saw a comment also about Baron Browning maybe moving to the inside. I don't see that happening. Baron Browning is full-time on the edge now, and he's really developed into that role quite well. But with Drew Sanders, I don't even know if he's going to see the field very much this year because he might not be back until October, November, and by that point, there just might not be a role for him. I could see a scenario where he basically remains on pup basically almost the whole year until maybe the end of the year where they can start integrating him in. I think the Broncos' true plans and vision for Drew Sanders are going to have to be in 2025 as opposed to 2024. Anything they get out of him in 2024 is going to be house money.
So you mentioned Cody Barton starting. Do you think that there's no chance Jonas Griffith gets a starting spot?
I actually think there's a very strong chance because Cody Barton was trash last year, like absolute trash. So if Griffith's able to showcase that he can stay healthy, I do too, man. And he was a starter at one point for this team in 2022 and was going to be a big-time role player in 2023 before he popped his ACL. It was super unfortunate. He just took a bad step as he was coming out of bounds on a play, happened right in front of me. Just really unfortunate for Jonas. But I think that this coming year, he's got a strong chance to be a starter because of, I'm just going to be honest, how bad Cody Barton was last year.
Well, and actually, I don't mean to rehash, obviously, the famous discourse between George Paton and Sean Payton hating each other, but do we know who actually was the one who went out and traded for Jonas Griffith? It was George Paton. George Paton was the one who actually went out and found, Jonas, and he's got the special teams value, and I think he's got a nice little instincts to him, right? I love the instincts to him where he can go out and really make a play. And I think that there was at least a stretch there where you actually got a chance to see the combination between he and Josie Jewell and how good they were. Then it was kind of young for at least an experiment, and that was fine. But then it really, looked like such a really bad experiment when he didn't turn his head when Jalen Hurts was running behind him. So I will never get that image out of my head when Jalen Hurts is running for like 40 yards and Kenny Young is literally, it's almost like he was a bot in a video game.
Like an NPC.
Like an NPC.
Remember, we were so excited about Stephen Weatherly at that time too.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
With the goggles.
Yeah. But I'm excited.
Oh, those were the days.
But I'm excited about Griffith. I'm excited to see what he can do. I think for Barton, what's interesting for me, and I will at least mention this. It feels like Barton is a bit of a Alex Singleton trajectory, at least on the outside looking at who Cody Barton is. He's a 100+ tackler in his career. Like he's actually shown that. Like he's actually shown to be 100% tackler in a season type of player. He's got special teams value. That is something that Alex Singleton, brought to the team in terms of special teams and everything. And then the moment week one hit, it's like he was a whole new ball player, like he was a whole new player at linebacker. And, let's not even, it would be remiss if we didn't talk about Singleton in preseason. Preseason, Alex Singleton was like a whole new linebacker. Like, and I mean that in a negative light. Like he was really bad in preseason. Then week one transpired and it was like, yeah, it's like that light went on and he's been your steady Mr. Linebacker one ever since then. And I think Cody Barton, the one area where it's a bit different between he and Singleton, and this is actually where it's more of a pro to bring in Barton and possibly him starting alongside Singleton, is he actually has a little bit more of a coverage ability to him than a guy like Josie Jewell. That's really where I think he's going to be making most of his money. He wasn't really necessarily good in some of the run defense scenarios or anything like that. And again, if he goes out and plays really well at that, kudos to him, because that you're talking about a scenario where possibly he would be your linebacker too at that point if he's really showing those instincts in run defense and really filling those gaps in. So I really could see a scenario where Barton is actually your linebacker too, just given the fact that he is maybe your best coverage linebacker on that team.
He's going to have to be at this rate, because unless Jonas can step up, I don't see another realistic option. Justin Sternad's a special teams player, maybe one of the undrafted guys. I know that Lavelle Bailey got some love today. I can't remember if it was Sean or if it was somebody in the media, but it was Sean. Okay, because I saw a tweet about Lavelle Bailey today. That is notable. That is very notable. So maybe
is it notable too that he got a big sign-on bonus?
Anytime a guy gets a big sign-on bonus like that, it's notable. Anytime, because that means that the team probably had to compete with other teams to get him, and they really wanted him. Same thing for Blake Watson. There's a reason why he got such a high signing bonus, is because there were other teams out there that were interested, and they basically had to win the UDFA bidding war for that player.
Yeah. One thing, the one player we mentioned his name briefly, but Riley Moss. Riley Moss had a great day. And speaking of a player who we weren't hearing anything about Riley Moss, at the tail end of last year, even at any point in terms of last year. However, it's worth noting the one time we actually saw action of Riley Moss, it actually possibly could have turned into an interception. It literally hit his hands and almost was an interception. So yeah, I think that there is I was talking, it was a Twitter interaction. It was with I think he was a coach with the Colorado Buffaloes, and actually he's coached against it. From what I heard, is that he coached against Riley Moss and Cooper DeJean, Mike Sanford, who does a radio show over on Altitude. But he said that Cooper DeJean is the most athletic between the two, but the best corner is Riley Moss. So I will just say this one more time again, like Iowa has really been a team that has predicated their defense on high intellectual players, athletic players, right? And I think that there was a reason why, to a degree, I was joking to a degree, but there's a reason why I was saying that Iowa had Cooper DeJean before Cooper DeJean, and it was Riley Moss. And I think that where you really could see somewhat of his value, and this is for him and really any other positions on the team, is probably special teams. I really could see some special teams value with Riley if they don't really see him, at least going forward right now, as a cornerback too. But that cornerback two spot, though, is very much in open arms, even despite the signing of Levi Wallace. And I really do think that if there's a chance to really develop him, I think he's got a chance to really be a very, very solid cornerback too for the team.
And Riley played special teams last year and was actually really good on special teams. That was something that really, really helped bolster the Broncos special teams unit last year, was the performance of Riley Moss. So I think that if he can continue that trajectory, that would be good. But in an ideal world, you want the guy who is your former third-round pick that you traded up for to be your cornerback too. I also will not count out Chris Abrams-Drain to win that role. Mm-hmm. I really, really like Chris Abrams-Drain's game, and I think that he's got arguably the highest ceiling between him, Riley Moss, Levi Wallace, and Damari Mathis, the four guys that you would probably argue would be competing for that cornerback 2 role. But again, I think that Riley Moss had the PBU today. He showcased that he is growing, he is developing, he is getting better. And if Moss ends up starting on defense, then maybe Abrams-Drain is the guy that you look at on special teams to have that impact. I think that's also something that we should look at, because the Broncos brought in Abrams-Drain with the vision and the philosophy of him being that versatile player. And in order to see that action right away, he might have to go through the similar route that Riley Moss did, where didn't really see a whole lot of snaps on defense in year one, had to make your hay on special teams, but in year two, maybe that's when you could see more of a role develop for Chris Abrams-Draine. And I've also thrown around the possibility of a dime role for Abrams-Draine. Jim Leonard is somebody who really raises the stock of every single player in that DB room, and that includes Pat Surtain as well. Mm-hmm. I would not be surprised if we see a career year from Pat Surtain, and it all starts with Jim Leonard. That's why we're seeing growth from Riley Moss. That's why I have such high hopes for Chris Abrams-Draine, and I'm even curious to see what Jim Leonard can do with a guy like Damari Mathis, who by the end of last year was basically classified as damaged goods defensively.
Non-existent.
Yeah, he was also good on special teams. I will give credit where it was due. Damari Mathis was good on special teams, but outside of that, it was terrible. That's why I'm so excited for Jim Leonard, because he can raise the stock and raise the value of every single player in that DB room.
Damari Mathis, when that season started last year, we had such high hopes for him. If in his rookie season against the Chargers, and he gets the 4 pass interference penalties, and it did not change the way he played aggressively the balance of the season. So going into last year, we had such high hopes, and it was disastrous. I mean, maybe as a compliment. So the fact that he's still in consideration for a roster spot and a high profile roster spot at that, is somewhat surprising to me. But it's all about depth in the cornerback room. So they're gonna, they're gonna give everyone a shot. I would imagine at this point, to see who rises to the top in these next couple of months.
And, with Damari Mathis, he's on a trajectory that's not a great trajectory. I mean, if there's anybody that kind of compares a bit to what we saw from Michael Ojemudia, it's Damari Mathis right now. And it did not end up well, for Michael Ojemudia. D-Rock, I see you mention Skinner. I think we're talking strictly the quarterback room. That said, though, Peyton had recently talked about Skinner going back to voluntary, about how much it seems like Skinner has grown. And while, it may have been scout team, Skinner was really turning heads, and it seemed like really developing and really making some impact in practices. So certainly a name that I absolutely would love to file away. And with Riley Moss, I think is also the possibility and look that maybe safety could be, an option for him, at least in some designed looks, right? In some designed looks. And I think that's, to Gage's point, that's what makes Jim Leonard such a unique and fascinating, discussion, because I said it before, Jim Leonard is going to end up being the best move the Broncos made the entire offseason. And that was before free agency. And and lo and behold, he's now gotten forgot about, right? He's now gotten forgot about, and he's now become the most underrated move of the entire offseason for the Denver Broncos. That be Jim Leonard. And
you called that too, Cam. Like the moment he was signed, you said don't underestimate the value that he's going to bring to this team. I mean, you were screaming it from the mountaintops right off the bat.
Yeah.
I'll also say this too in regards to Jaquan McMillan. Our vision for him has almost strictly been at nickel. According to reports from Cecil Lammey and Andrew Mason, it may not just be nickel. They couldn't exactly elaborate on what other role, but you could probably figure it out.
Wow.
Jaquan's getting snaps on the boundary.
Oh, I was going to say, wow, they're going to have him like Travis Hunter. They're going to have him play wide receiver. This is amazing.
Dude, imagine. But no, Jaquan's seeing snaps on the boundary. I mean, that's what you can deduce from that. So that just the versatility of players that we maybe think of strictly as a nickel, maybe we could see a guy like Jaquan McMillan be on the outside and maybe somebody else fill that nickel role. That's something that kind of caught me off guard when I first heard that, but not exactly surprised because Jaquan was getting snaps on the boundary in camp last year as well.
So guys, totally shifting gears here. ProFootballTalk.com just published a story about Sean Payton that Shereen Williams wrote. It said Sean Payton did something Tuesday he had never done. He wore sunglasses at practice. Payton had cataract surgery on his left eye last Thursday and will have cataract surgery on his right eye Wednesday, Mike Kliss of 9 News reports. First day ever wearing sunglasses coaching, Payton told Kliss, waiting for Parcells' phone call to call him a wimp. Not wearing sunglasses explains the cataracts. Payton revealed at a season-ending news conference that he was going to get his eyes fixed in the offseason after calling the wrong play on his play sheet once during the 2023 season. That was embarrassing, Payton said on January 9th. Now, if the Broncos if only the Broncos can get their future so bright that Payton has to wear shades. So it doesn't sound like he's going to be around tomorrow, but it's this team's all about improvement.
I'm curious to see who's going to act as head coach tomorrow. Is it going to be Mike Westhoff? Maybe VJ? I'm curious to see who's going to. That'd be insane. I'd be down to see that.
Davis Webb.
Davis Webb.
Oh,
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Davis ends up leading the charge on offense. Him and Joe Lombardi. I mean, it would not surprise me at all if maybe Davis was the guy radioing in the plays to Bo Nix and all the other quarterbacks. So yeah, man. Sean, last year, you noticed on the sideline, he was wearing those readers, especially during night games when it was dark out. So I'm glad he's getting that fixed. And I'm glad he's doing it now, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, man, that's pretty funny that he called the wrong play. Imagine, and Russell probably got the play and was like, what?
Well, so that explains it then. Unfortunately, that explains it. Sean Payton was the problem and not Russell Wilson. That explains it.
Yep, because Sean Payton's blind.
You mentioned Davis Webb, though. Doesn't it feel like every day we have Davis Webb is one day closer to him not being a member of the Broncos staff?
Yeah.
Well, actually, I think that there's actually a chance that, he could be the head coach in waiting. It's a lot to certainly forecast and everything, but given with how things, shake out in terms of the offense and with Payton, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility he's an offensive coordinator with the team. And I actually don't even think it's crazy to think that he had a defensive coordinator, like, in terms of Dennis Allen, who would just always stay with him. I don't actually, think it's crazy to think of like an offensive coordinator, someone that's actually going to stay with him, who's young, stay with him and actually be with him for quite a bit and then become, the head coach and stuff. I'm not saying that he'll be like the Vic Fangio where he'll finally get his head coaching gig at, age 99. I'm not saying something like that, but I'm saying like, once he maybe eclipses like, 40 or maybe even 50 is kind of like where you'll probably see him in that sweet age of like getting his final like head coaching gig and stuff. So this could be, prolonged for a little bit, possibly is, maybe him sticking in terms of with Sean. But yeah, it's pretty obvious that Webb is such a bright and like intellectual, coach on that sideline. And, ever since we heard the story about him when he was hired with the Giants and obviously the Bills, like it was crazy. The fact that really, one of the coaches who wasn't a coach that was really a part of those meetings and part of those film rooms was Davis Webb. And, Josh Allen, Daniel Jones just raved about how smart Webb was. And, and we're really starting to see really it all unfold. And even going to this year, right, with the draft process and how much involved he was with the draft process and being interviewing candidates, interviewing QB candidates, interviewing, draft players. Like he was heavily involved.
He's the guy they sent to pick up Bo Nix from Alabama.
Which by the way, did you guys get a chance to catch Jay Glazer's podcast with Sean Payton? I actually tweeted a really long clip. Obviously, it's not news that he gushes about Bo Nix, but did you catch a little snippet of actually what Sean Payton wanted to do when he drafted Bo Nix? Did you guys
show up at the front door?
He actually wanted to show up at his house.
Oh, That's so cool.
Yeah.
I mean, next best thing, send Davis Webb. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. When it comes to Davis Webb, I think another unique advantage that he has is not only has he's played in the modern NFL.
Mhm.
Guys who played 15, 20 years ago, the game was so much different, even back then, that recently. Davis Webb played as recently as 2022. He knows the ins and outs of what it takes to win in the NFL right now. And he's been on some good organizations, most notably the Buffalo Bills. He knows what it's like to be in a winning locker room and be around a quarterback like Josh Allen with winning habits. That is huge. And I think it's something that players, especially younger players like Bo Nix and Zach Wilson, are really going to resonate towards.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you guys have any final thoughts? Glenn, you came in a bit late, but do you have any stuff?
No, I mean, I appreciate you guys allowing me to be a part of the, just to witness our youngest's game. So thank you so much. And great conversation, great chat tonight. It's we appreciate all the listeners, especially on days like this where, we're so reliant on, some of the nuggets that get thrown out by the reporters that are allowed on site. So we really appreciate, the participation. So.
Yeah. And do not be shocked. Okay. Like mainly Broncos is smart. Do not be shocked if we regurgitate some of the tonight.
And don't be shocked if I regurgitate the same stuff on Broncos Syndicate.
So just want to, do like a podcast, Broncos podcast PSA right there. Like, don't be surprised if stuff gets regurgitated and we start talking about some of the same stuff.
It's Groundhog Day week on MHRT Network.
Right. But yes, make sure you go and tune into Gage's Broncos Syndicate show. It got recognized, obviously, by Mike Carmelini over there on Twitter. It was nice to see that shout out for Gage in the subscribers that he has. A lot of subscribers, and if you haven't even subscribed to Gage's podcast, make sure you do so. It is a fantastic podcast and network over there. And of course, make sure you hit that subscribe button for the MHRT network as well. Let's continue to grow our network over on MHRT. A lot of great shows over on the network. Wild West is obviously before, mainly on Wednesday. The Cluster Puck is still going around. There's no hockey season necessary for the Avalanche, but the Stanley Cup is going around. So the Cluster Puck is going on. Bronco Bill, Charger fan, Bronco Bill.
Number one Charger.
Yeah, number one Charger fan is on Friday. So we've got you guys.
Sports nonsense starts in 2 minutes.
Starts in 2 minutes, where they literally talk about nonsense.
Sports,
right?
Not necessarily in that order.
Exactly. But yeah, so we certainly have got a lot on the MHRT network, and it's a blast being a part of it. So again, make sure you subscribe to the network. And Glenn and I shared it a couple days ago, but please, we have a swag shop. So if you guys are interested in, buying some swag, getting some swag of your favorite podcast or, stuff like that, make sure you go click the link and go buy yourself, some swag. I think we still have our 20% off, right? That's going on right now.
I think it's in its waning moments if it hasn't expired at this point.
Yeah. It's not exactly the deal that has been going around in terms of like the Bo Nix jerseys and the Broncos jerseys that's been going around. Kudos to Sarah Bettinger. He's the one that dropped it for us and dropped it on Twitter that apparently it's like on quite a sale right now. Like it's like $97. So you could actually buy a Bo Nix jersey for about $100 plus tax. So, I mean, if you want to jump on that, you might as well jump on it now. To answer your guys' question, no, we do not sell personalized MHRT jerseys, of like, Glenn Hauser and, 69, on the front and the back. And, like we don't sell any personalized.
Don't sell that, no.
We don't sell personalized jerseys, unfortunately. So please make sure you you tune into the rest of the shows on the
I'm
network.
like that meme, with like what?
So please tune into the rest of the shows over on the network. It's been an absolute blast. And go Broncos. And until next time, until we have another episode of the 5280 podcast. See you next time.
Fast lane when I pass in the street, bag of money in the passenger seat. Tempo's been asking for me on the road from the west to the east. Way up, I might never come down, cause the coast racking up the flame out. So high,